8 million people die from tobacco every year. Not 8 million over a decade. Not 8 million across a century of industrial history. 8 million in a single year, every year, without interruption, without slowdown, without the world treating it as the emergency it is. That number is larger than the entire population of Switzerland. It exceeds the total death toll of the First World War, compressed into 12 months, then repeated again the following January. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand what 8 million looks like, consider this. A commercial airplane carries roughly 300 passengers. 8 million deaths means the equivalent of 73 fully loaded planes falling out of the sky every single day. No survivors, every day. The world would stop. Governments would collapse. Every television channel on Earth would broadcast nothing else. But tobacco kills at that rate quietly, consistently and legally. And the news cycle moves on. There are 1.3 billion smokers alive right now. That figure has barely moved in 20 years despite decades of warning labels, advertising bans, tax hikes, and graphic images of diseased lungs printed directly on cigarette packs. The number does not go down. In some regions of the world it is going up, and that 1.3 billion does not include the 100 million people, most of them under 30, who have never touched a cigarette but are addicted to the same molecule delivered through a device the size of a USB drive. The molecule is called nicotine. Here is the part that stops most people cold. Nicotine itself does not cause cancer. It does not destroy the lungs. It does not harden the arteries or rot the gums or turn the fingers yellow. Nicotine is not what kills. Nicotine is only what makes it impossible to stop, and that distinction is the most important and most misunderstood fact in the entire history of this substance. It is the reason the cigarette exists at all. It is the reason the vape pen exists. It is the reason that every time the delivery system changes, the addiction survives. A single cigarette contains over 7,000 chemical compounds. 70 of them are known carcinogens. The burning paper, the combusted tobacco leaf, the tar. Those are what destroy the body over years and decades. But nicotine is the reason the body keeps asking for another one. It is the hook inside every product, old and new. Remove nicotine and the cigarette becomes a burning piece of paper. Nobody would smoke it twice. In 2024, health researchers in Sao Paulo documented a 15-year-old boy who had been using a disposable vape for 14 months. He had never smoked a cigarette. He had never seen his parents smoke. He had started because a device that looked like a highlighter pen and tasted like mango had been passed around during a lunch break at his school. By the time his parents noticed, he was using it 30 to 40 times a day. More puffs of nicotine than a pack-a-day smoker consumes in the same period. His withdrawal symptoms when the device ran out were severe enough that his mother initially thought he had the flu. The same year in Seoul, a 16-year-old girl was referred to an addiction clinic. In London, a 14-year-old boy was caught vaping in a school bathroom for the 4th time. Different countries, different languages, different devices with different flavors and different brand names. The same molecule. The numbers among teenagers are accelerating so fast that researchers have stopped comparing them to previous vaping statistics. They are now comparing them to cigarette smoking rates at their absolute historical peak. The 1950s and 1960s, the era when half of all American adults smoked, when cigarettes were handed out free to soldiers, when a physician could appear in a magazine advertisement recommending a particular brand for digestive health. Teen vaping in some countries has already exceeded those peak cigarette numbers. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, the epidemic, the devices, the 1.3 billion, the 8 million, there is a plant. It grows in warm soil. Its leaves are broad and green. Indigenous peoples in the Americas cultivated it for at least 3,000 years before a European ever laid eyes on it. They did not use it to fill a midday craving or steady their nerves before a meeting. They used it in ceremony, in healing, in prayer. A shaman in what is now the American Southwest would use tobacco in doses and contexts that a modern pharmacologist would recognize as deliberate and controlled. It was not casual. It was not recreational. It was considered in many cultures a direct line to the divine. That plant, that ceremony, that 3,000-year tradition is where this story begins. How does something considered sacred become the leading cause of preventable death on the planet? How does a gift from the gods become a product engineered in a laboratory to be as addictive as possible, sold to children in candy flavors, and defended in courtrooms for half a century while the bodies piled up? The distance between those 2 points is not just a history of tobacco. It is a history of science, of money, of institutions that chose profit over evidence, and of ordinary people caught between forces they never knew existed. The story does not start in a factory. It does not start in a boardroom or a laboratory or a congressional hearing. It starts in a forest, with smoke rising towards something the people who lit the fire believed was listening. The tobacco plant did not begin as a commodity. It began as a technology. 3,000 years before the first European ship crossed the Atlantic, indigenous peoples across the Americas had developed a sophisticated and precise relationship with Nicotiana tabacum that had nothing to do with habit or pleasure in the casual sense those words carry today. The Maya of the Yucatan depicted tobacco in stone carvings as early as the 1st century AD, priests exhaling smoke in ritual contexts, the curl of it rising toward figures that represented gods. The Cherokee used it in healing ceremonies where the dose, the timing, and the method of consumption were as carefully calibrated as anything a modern physician might prescribe. Among the Sioux of the Great Plains, a pipe of tobacco was the seal on an agreement between nations, more binding in their legal framework than any written document. The plant itself demands attention. Nicotiana tabacum grows tall, sometimes over 2 meters, with pale pink flowers and leaves that can span the width of a man's chest. When the leaf is dried and burned, the smoke it produces contains hundreds of active compounds. But the one that matters, the one that crosses the blood-brain barrier within seconds of inhalation, the one that shamans had understood empirically for generations, is an alkaloid that the plant produces as a pesticide, a natural insecticide. The tobacco plant makes nicotine to kill insects that try to eat it. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. The most widely consumed psychoactive substance in human history is a poison the plant invented to protect itself. The insects it was designed to kill, and the humans who became dependent on it, share the same basic vulnerability. A nervous system with receptors that nicotine fits like a key in a lock. In ceremonial use, the doses were high. Some accounts from early Spanish observers describe shamans in states that modern researchers, reading the same accounts centuries later, recognize as acute nicotine intoxication. The dizziness, the altered perception, the profound physical response that comes from a large sudden dose. This was not accidental. The physiological intensity was part of the point. The body's violent reaction to the substance was understood as contact with something beyond ordinary experience. The plant was not being abused. It was being used exactly as intended, as a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, controlled by people who had spent lifetimes learning its properties. Then October 1492 arrived and the bridge collapsed. When Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, the Taino people who greeted his ships brought gifts. Among them were dried tobacco leaves, offered with the same ceremonial weight they always carried. Columbus's crew had no framework for understanding what they had been given. The leaves were dark, pungent, unfamiliar. Several sailors reportedly threw them into the sea. One did not. Rodrigo de Jerez, a sailor from Ayamonte in southern Spain, watched the taino and understood that the leaves were meant to be burned and inhaled. He tried it. He kept trying it across the voyage home. By the time he stepped off the ship in Spain in 1493, he had brought the habit with him, exhaling smoke in the streets of his hometown, drawing crowds of bewildered and then frightened onlookers. The neighbours reported him to the Spanish Inquisition. His charge, in the formal language of 1493, was that only a man in league with the devil could swallow fire and breathe out smoke. He was imprisoned for several years. By the time Rodrigo de Jerez was released, the habit had spread further than any Inquisition could stop. Within 5 decades of Columbus's first voyage, tobacco was moving through European trade routes with striking speed. Portuguese merchants brought it from Brazil to West Africa and then to Asia. Spanish ships carried it across the Pacific to the Philippines and from there to China, where it reached the imperial court before 1600. The plant that had grown in the Americas for millennia suddenly existed on every inhabited continent within a single human lifetime. Europe, however, needed a story to explain why it was acceptable. The story it chose was medicine. In 1559, a French diplomat named Jean Nicot arrived in Lisbon as the French ambassador to the Portuguese court. He was a careful, scholarly man, a lexicographer by passion, who would later compile one of the first French dictionaries. In Lisbon, he encountered tobacco, which Portuguese traders had been importing from Brazil for years. He was told it had healing properties. He was skeptical by nature, but thorough by habit, so he began experimenting, applying crushed tobacco leaves to wounds, preparing poultices, having people inhale the smoke. When a courier in his household suffered from a severe migraine, Nicot prepared a tobacco powder administered through the nose. The migraine subsided. Nicot wrote to the French Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici, describing tobacco as a powerful medicinal herb. He sent her a sample. The Queen used it for her own persistent headaches and reported relief. Within months, the plant was being called herbe de la reine, the Queen's herb. Within years, physicians across France were prescribing it for toothache, skin conditions, intestinal parasites, respiratory ailments, and melancholy. In 1571, a Spanish physician named Nicolas Monardes published a book that catalogued tobacco's supposed medical uses. The list ran to dozens of conditions. Cancer was on it. Tobacco was listed as a treatment for cancer. The plant was formally classified as Nicotiana tabacum by the botanist Charles de Lecluse. The molecule inside it was named after Jean Nicot, the man who sent headache powder to a queen. The name stuck. It still carries his name today, Nicotine, and the irony of that naming would not become fully apparent for another 400 years. European physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries were not fools operating in ignorance. They were working with the tools and frameworks available to them, and within those frameworks tobacco produced observable, measurable effects. It reduced pain, it altered mood, it calmed anxiety, and in larger doses produced profound physiological responses. Given that the most common medical theory of the era held that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's humours, a substance this pharmacologically active seemed genuinely promising. The enthusiasm was not manufactured, it was real. But enthusiasm for a substance and understanding of a substance are different things, and in 1559 nobody in Europe, or anywhere else, had the tools to understand what nicotine was actually doing inside a human body. They could see the effects, they could not see the mechanism, and the mechanism was the part that mattered. By 1600, tobacco was being sold in pharmacies across England, France, Spain, and Portugal. A pipe of tobacco was available for purchase in London for a penny, cheaper than a meal. The physician to King James I of England estimated that by 1604, over 7,000 tobacco shops had opened in the city of London alone. James himself despised the habit, writing a pamphlet called A Counterblast to Tobacco, in which he described smoking as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He was the first European head of state to formally denounce tobacco. He was ignored completely. And then something happened that made ignoring him very easy. Tobacco found an economy, and once it found an economy, no king's pamphlet was ever going to be enough. In the spring of 1612, a young English settler named John Rolfe planted a different variety of tobacco seed in the soil of Jamestown, Virginia. The colony was failing. Of the 500 settlers who had arrived between 1607 and 1609, fewer than 60 were still alive by the winter of 1609. They had died of starvation, disease, and violence. The land was difficult, the supply lines from England unreliable, and the Virginia Company, the investors back in London who had funded the whole venture, was running out of patience. Jamestown needed to produce something valuable, or it would be abandoned. Rolfe had tried the local tobacco variety that the Powhatan people grew, but English merchants found it too bitter. So he obtained seeds of a sweeter Caribbean variety, Nicotine tabacum, and planted them experimentally in the cleared soil near the James River. The first harvest sold in London for a price that silenced every critic of the colony. Within 7 years, Jamestown colonists were growing tobacco in the streets, in the cemetery, in every available patch of ground. The Virginia governor wrote to London complaining that settlers had even torn up the marketplace to plant it. By 1619, Virginia was exporting 10,000 pounds of tobacco per year to England. By 1629, that number was 1.5 million pounds. The plant had not just saved the colony, it had given the English crown a reason to invest in North America at a scale that would reshape the continent. But tobacco had a problem. It was extraordinarily labour-intensive. The leaf required planting, careful tending through the growing season, harvesting by hand, curing in specialised barns, sorting and packing. All of it demanding more workers than the Virginia colony could supply through voluntary immigration. The solution the colony's landowners reached for was not new. It was not even debated for long. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. The same year tobacco exports began their steep climb. The same year the Virginia General Assembly held its first session. The same year the English were beginning to understand what they had. The connection was not incidental, it was structural. Tobacco required enslaved labour to be profitable at scale, and the profits from tobacco financed the infrastructure, the ships, the ports, the colonial administration, that made the transatlantic slave trade viable as an ongoing enterprise. By 1700, Virginia alone held more than 16,000 enslaved people. By 1770, that number exceeded 180,000. The tobacco economy and the slave economy were not parallel systems running alongside each other. They were the same system. One plant, grown in American soil, had set in motion two catastrophes simultaneously, and neither of them was visible yet in the pipe smoke curling above a London coffee house. Europe in the 1600s consumed tobacco primarily through pipes. The habit spread through every social class with a speed that alarmed rulers and delighted merchants. Pope Urban VIII issued a formal papal bull in 1642 threatening excommunication for anyone who smoked in church. The Ottoman Sultan Murad IV made tobacco consumption punishable by death and reportedly had hundreds of smokers executed. The Russian Tsar Michael I ordered that first-time tobacco users be whipped and have their nostrils slit. Repeat offenders were killed. None of it worked. Not the executions, not the mutilations, not the excommunications. The habit crossed every border and survived every prohibition, And the reason it survived is the same reason every subsequent attempt to simply ban tobacco has failed. The molecule was already in the bodies of enough people that stopping felt, to those people, physically impossible. By the 1700s, the attempts at prohibition had largely collapsed, and tobacco had evolved into new forms. Snuff, finely ground tobacco inhaled through the nose, became fashionable among European aristocracy with a speed that bordered on obsession. Frederick the Great of Prussia was rarely seen without his snuff box. Napoleon Bonaparte consumed so much snuff that his valet reportedly kept a spare uniform nearby for the occasions when the emperor spilled it down his front. Snuff was not just a habit, it was a social ritual, a marker of refinement, a reason to extend a hand and offer something intimate to a companion. Then came Cuba and the cigar, and a new century. By the early 1800s, cigars imported from Cuba had reached the elite markets of Europe and North America. Cigarettes, hand-rolled, small, the tobacco wrapped in paper rather than a leaf, existed in Spain and had spread to soldiers across various European conflicts who found them easier to use in the field than pipes. The cigarette was clearly the future of the product. It was fast, cheap to produce, and required no special equipment. The only problem was the speed at which a human pair of hands could roll them. In 1880, a young inventor from Virginia named James Bonsack filed a patent for a mechanical cigarette rolling machine. The device could produce 120,000 cigarettes per day. A skilled human roller could produce roughly 3,000. The machine made a human worker 40 times slower than obsolete. Within months of its first commercial deployment, the cost of a single cigarette dropped so dramatically that it crossed a threshold that would prove irreversible, the threshold at which a cigarette became affordable to anyone with a coin in their pocket. One man understood immediately what Bonsack's machine meant. James Buchanan Duke, known as Buck, was the son of a North Carolina tobacco farmer, and had grown up watching his father sell small batch tobacco products in a market dominated by larger competitors. When Bonsack's machine became available, Duke negotiated an exclusive licensing deal and installed the machines in his Durham factory. By 1889, Duke's American Tobacco Company was producing 834 million cigarettes per year. He then did something the industry had never seen before. He spent money, enormous amounts of it, on advertising. The advertising campaigns Duke launched in the late 1880s and 1890s introduced techniques that were entirely new. Cigarette cards, small illustrated collectibles inserted into every pack, created an incentive to buy more in order to complete a series. The cards featured athletes, actresses, military figures, and exotic animals. Children collected them. Adults collected them. The brand became a cultural presence that existed entirely separately from the product itself. Then came something more significant, the celebrity endorsement. In 1905, a physician's face appeared in a tobacco advertisement for the first time. The ad claimed the cigarette was recommended by doctors for its mild, smooth quality. The physician was named, credentialed, and photographed. It was not a one-off. Over the following decades, the image of the medical professional endorsing cigarettes became a standard feature of tobacco advertising across every major American brand. By the 1930s, campaigns ran with taglines stating that more doctors smoked a particular brand than any other. The surveys those claims were based on were conducted by the tobacco companies themselves, with participation incentivized by gifts of free cigarettes sent to physicians prior to the survey. The doctor holding a cigarette had become the most powerful image in the history of marketing. And somewhere in a research laboratory, the first faint signal was beginning to appear. A pattern in patient records, a cluster of cases, a disease that had been extraordinarily rare at the start of the century, and was now appearing with increasing frequency in the same population that had, in the same decades, taken up cigarettes in the largest numbers in history. The signal was quiet. Nobody in the industry was paying attention to it yet, or so it seemed. The war did not create the cigarette habit, it industrialized it. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the military command faced a practical problem that no training manual had anticipated: the psychological management of men sitting in trenches waiting to die. The solution the army settled on was already in every American city: the cigarette. General John Pershing sent a telegram to Washington in 1917 stating that tobacco was as indispensable to soldiers as food. The Red Cross, the YMCA, and private citizens organised campaigns to ship cigarettes to the front. Women held tobacco drives the same way they held food drives. By the time the war ended, an entire generation of American men had been introduced to cigarettes by the United States government, free of charge, in the most psychologically vulnerable conditions human beings can occupy. They brought the habit home. The 1920s American cigarette market expanded at a rate that made even Buck Duke's most ambitious projections look conservative. Women, who'd been largely excluded from public smoking by social convention, became a target. The American Tobacco Company hired Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, and the man who would later be called the father of public relations, to change that. Bernays arranged for a group of women to march in the 1929 New York Easter Parade smoking cigarettes, which he had briefed journalists in advance to describe as torches of freedom, symbols of women's liberation from social restriction. The stunt worked beyond anyone's projections. Female smoking rates in America doubled within a decade. In 1929, the same year Bernays orchestrated that parade, a German physician named Fritz Lickint published a paper drawing a statistical connection between smoking and lung cancer. It was the first formal published link between the two. The paper appeared in a German medical journal, cited clinical observations, and was largely ignored outside Germany. The tobacco industry in America did not respond to it. There was no reason to. It had not yet reached the audience that mattered. Then came the Second World War, and the scale of everything expanded again. The US government classified tobacco as an essential war material in 1942. Cigarettes were included in military rations alongside food. Tobacco companies received priority access to raw materials during wartime shortages that affected almost every other consumer industry. Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, American Tobacco, and Liggett and Myers sent millions of free cigarettes to troops overseas, understanding with complete clarity what free product given to captive populations in extreme stress would produce. Customers for life. Production numbers from this period are difficult to fully absorb. By 1944, American cigarette manufacturers were producing 290 billion cigarettes per year. That is roughly 2,000 cigarettes for every man, woman, and child in the United States, smoker or not. Dorothy Holloway turned 19 in the spring of 1944. She lived in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a city whose entire economy had been organized around tobacco since the late 1800s. The R.J. Reynolds plant dominated the skyline and the air of the city in equal measure. The smell of curing tobacco was not a background detail in Winston-Salem. It was a presence, specific and constant, the way salt is a presence near the ocean. Dot had grown up breathing it. Her father had worked at Reynolds for 20 years. Her two older brothers were overseas. She took a job at the plant processing tobacco leaves, sorting, bundling, moving through the warm and heavy air of the factory floor for 9 hours a day. Most of the women she worked alongside smoked. During the 50-minute morning break, the benches outside filled with smoke. It was social, it was fast, and in the specific exhaustion of factory work during wartime, It was a reliable 10 minutes of something that felt like rest. One afternoon in October, a co-worker named Patricia pressed a cigarette into Dot's hand without ceremony, the way one person hands another a cup of coffee. Dot lit it. She held the smoke in, the way she'd watched others do it. Within seconds, something shifted. A warmth that moved up through the chest and arrived somewhere behind the eyes. A loosening of the specific tension that had lived in her shoulders since her brothers shipped out. Her hands, which had been moving all morning, went still. She didn't think about what had caused it. There was no reason to. In 1944, that response to a cigarette was not a warning sign. It was the product working exactly as advertised. To understand what happened inside Dot's body in that moment, it helps to understand the mechanism, not in the language of biochemistry, but in the language of what it actually felt like and why. Nicotine, when inhaled, travels through the lungs and enters the bloodstream with a speed that no other common method of drug delivery matches. It reaches the brain in approximately 10 seconds. Once there, it binds to receptors, structures in the brain that normally respond to acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter involved in attention, memory and muscle activation. When nicotine occupies those receptors, the brain releases dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, the same circuit activated by food, by sex, by any experience the brain categorizes as essential to survival. The brain does not distinguish between genuine survival rewards and chemical imitations of them. It records the experience as important, as something to repeat. But nicotine metabolizes fast. Within 30 to 40 minutes, blood nicotine levels drop sharply, and the dopamine signal fades with them. The brain, which has just filed this experience as significant, notices the absence, not as a mild preference, as a deficit, a small but insistent gap between the current state and the state recorded as good. The next cigarette closes that gap, but the brain adjusts its baseline. Over days and weeks of repeated use, the gap at baseline grows slightly larger, which means the cigarette closes it less completely than it did the first time. The dose that once produced relief now merely prevents discomfort. This is the trap. It does not announce itself. Dot smoked one cigarette that first day. She smoked 2 during the following week's breaks. By December, she was buying her own packs. By the following spring, she was smoking 10 cigarettes a day without tracking it, the way a person doesn't track the number of times they check a door is locked. It had become part of the rhythm of the day, invisible inside ordinary life. The country she lived in gave her no reason to question this. In 1944, the American Medical Association accepted advertising revenue from tobacco companies. Hospitals, actual hospital wards, had cigarette vending machines in their lobbies. The most prominent cigarette advertising campaign of the era featured a physician's endorsement in language so specific and credentialed that patients cited it to their own doctors as evidence of safety. Chesterfield Cigarettes ran advertisements in medical journals stating the brand had no adverse effects on nose, throat or sinuses, a claim generated by a study the company had designed, funded and reviewed before publication. Dot's own doctor smoked during appointments. The ashtray on his desk was ceramic, small and shaped like a leaf. In 1945, the war ended and her brothers came home. Both of them smoked. Her mother did not, but she never said anything about it. The habit was so universal in their social world that objecting to it would have been as strange as objecting to coffee. Dot married a man named George Holloway in 1946. George smoked a pack a day. Their first apartment smelled of cigarettes the way the Reynolds plant did. Not unpleasant to people inside it. Simply the atmosphere of a life. She tried to stop for the first time in 1948 after reading a short piece in a women's magazine suggesting that smoking could dull the complexion. She lasted 4 days. The fourth night she found herself standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with a specific irrational agitation that she could not name and could not route through any other channel. She lit a cigarette. The agitation dissolved in under a minute. She would try to understand what that agitation was and fail to name it for the next 17 years. The word that described it existed in scientific literature: withdrawal. But in 1948, that word was not attached to nicotine in any public medical framework. Nicotine was not classified as addictive. It was not classified as anything in particular. It was simply the active compound in a legal product consumed by roughly half the American adult population. There were no warning labels. There were no restrictions on sale to minors. There was a cigarette vending machine in the lobby of the hospital where Dot delivered her first child in 1949. Somewhere in Philadelphia, a young physician named Evelyn Marsh was completing her residency in pulmonology at Jefferson Hospital. She had started smoking in medical school. Almost everyone had. In her third year of residency, she began to notice a pattern in her patient records that she couldn't make fit with anything she'd been taught. 3 patients that year. Advanced lung cancer. The disease had been rare enough at the start of her medical training that a single case was notable. 3 in 1 year was not random variation. She looked at their charts, looking for the shared factor, the occupational exposure, the geographic commonality, the genetic link. All 3 were heavy smokers. She wrote a single line in her personal journal, a small green notebook she kept in the breast pocket of her white coat. The line read, "Is this coincidence?" Then she closed the notebook, put it back in her pocket and walked out to finish her rounds. She had a cigarette in the stairwell before her next patient. The question she had written down was already being asked, with far more data behind it, by researchers on 2 different continents. The answers they were arriving at were not going to stay in scientific journals for long. The signal that had been quiet for decades was getting louder, and some people, in very specific offices in very specific buildings, were already listening. In September 1950, 2 studies landed in American medical journals within weeks of each other, and the world of tobacco, though it did not yet know it, changed permanently. The first came from Ernst Winder and Evelyn Graham, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Winder was a medical student at Washington University in St. Louis, 27 years old, who had become fixated on the rising lung cancer numbers after watching a surgeon perform a lung removal on a patient who had smoked 3 packs a day for 30 years. Winder spent 2 years conducting interviews with 684 lung cancer patients and 780 patients hospitalized for other conditions, comparing their smoking histories with methodical precision. The results were not ambiguous. Among the lung cancer patients, 96.5% were moderate to heavy smokers. The correlation was so clean it looked, to other researchers seeing it for the first time, almost too clean. The second study came from England. Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill had analysed the smoking habits of 5,000 hospital patients across London. Their findings aligned with Winder and Graham's with an exactness that ruled out coincidence as an explanation. 2 independent research teams working in different countries with different patient populations, using different methodologies, had arrived at the same doorstep. Evelyn Marsh read the Doll Hill study on a Tuesday evening in her office at Jefferson Hospital, her coat still on, a cup of cold coffee beside her elbow. She read it twice. Then she opened her desk drawer, took out the small green notebook, and turned to the entry from 2 years earlier. 1 line. Is this coincidence? She stared at it for a moment, then wrote 2 words underneath. It isn't. She closed the notebook and put it back. Then she reached into her coat pocket. She lit a cigarette. The gap between knowing something intellectually and the body's response to that knowledge is one of the most consistent and least discussed features of nicotine addiction. Marsh understood, in the full clinical sense of that word, what the study she'd just read implied. She had 3 current patients with advanced lung cancer. She had watched this disease reshape a lung from the outside, had seen the texture of it on X-ray films held up to light boxes in dark corridors. The knowledge was not abstract, and yet the hand moved to the pocket. The match was struck, and the first inhale produced the familiar shift, the settling of something that had been slightly unsettled, and the cigarette burned down to the filter before she left the office. This was not weakness or hypocrisy. It was the mechanism operating exactly as designed. The 1950 studies created a moment of public attention that the tobacco industry had been anticipating and preparing for since at least 1946, when internal industry research the public would not see for another 40 years, had begun producing its own uncomfortable conclusions. The industry's response to the 1950 publications was not panic. It was a plan. In December 1953, the chief executives of America's largest tobacco companies gathered at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The meeting was not publicly announced. The attendees represented Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, American Tobacco, Brown and Williamson, Lorillard, and Liggett and Myers, the companies whose products were in the pockets of roughly half the American adult population. They hired a public relations firm called Hill and Knowlton, which had previously worked on behalf of the steel and aviation industries. The assignment given to Hill and Knowlton was specific. The problem was not the science. The problem was public perception of the science. Those were not the same problem, and the solution to one was not the solution to the other. Hill and Knowlton's strategy, developed over the weeks following the Plaza meeting, was elegant in its simplicity. It did not require disproving the Winder Graham or Dolehill studies. It required only making the public believe that the science was unsettled, that experts disagreed, that more research was needed, that it was too soon to draw conclusions. In a country where most people do not read scientific journals, the distance between the science says X and scientists are debating whether X is true is vast. Hill and Knowlton understood this distance better than almost anyone. The instrument they designed to occupy that distance was called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. Announced in January 1954 through a full-page advertisement placed in 448 newspapers simultaneously, the TIRC presented itself as an independent scientific body committed to finding the truth about tobacco and health. The frank statement to cigarette smokers, as the ad was titled, acknowledged public concern, expressed the industry's dedication to the well-being of consumers, and promised rigorous, unbiased research. It was signed by the heads of every major tobacco company. The TIRC was not independent. Its research agenda was controlled by the tobacco companies that funded it. Studies that produced inconvenient results were not published. The scientists who worked under its umbrella were not told this explicitly. Many of them believed they were conducting genuine research. The structure was designed so that the manipulation happened at the level of funding allocation and publication decisions, not at the level of individual scientists who could later testify that they had never been pressured. This was the architecture of manufactured doubt, and it worked. Between 1954 and 1964, American cigarette consumption continued to rise despite the published science. The TIRC issued statements, funded minor studies on tangential questions, and cited the absence of a definitive mechanistic proof, rather than the overwhelming epidemiological evidence, as justification for continued uncertainty. Newspapers that ran the frank statement in 1954 also ran TIRC press releases in 1957 and 1960, presenting the two sides of the debate with the false equivalence that journalistic balance demands. Dot Holloway, reading a newspaper in her kitchen in Winston-Salem in 1957, encountered an article about the cancer question. The article presented both perspectives. Researchers concerned about the link, the TIRC noting that the evidence was not conclusive. She smoked while she read it. The article resolved nothing. She turned to the crossword. She was 32. She smoked a pack a day. She had 2 children under 8. She had tried to quit 3 times. The most recent attempt had lasted 11 days before a difficult phone call. Her mother ill, the hospital uncertain, her husband travelling for work, had sent her to the convenience store 2 blocks away at 9 in the evening. She bought a pack of Winstons. She was home and smoking within 15 minutes of hanging up the phone. Her hands had been shaking for most of the day. She did not know that the difficulty she experienced trying to stop had a name in scientific literature. She did not know that the company whose name was printed on her cigarette pack had, in its own internal research, begun to understand the mechanism of that difficulty with considerable precision. Evelyn Marsh, meanwhile, was building a case that no journal editor could ignore. By 1958, she had documented 41 lung cancer patients at Jefferson Hospital. 39 had been smokers. The 2 non-smokers had worked for decades in environments with heavy second-hand smoke. She submitted a paper to the American Journal of Medicine, presenting her case series alongside the existing epidemiological literature. The paper was rejected. The editor's notes cited insufficient sample size and the absence of a proven biological mechanism. She resubmitted to 3 other journals, 2 rejections, 1 acceptance in a smaller publication with limited circulation. A researcher at a tobacco company read the paper, she learned this much later, and filed it in a cabinet labelled Adverse Studies. The cabinet was not metaphorical. It was a physical filing cabinet in a physical office. Inside it, over the following decade, went paper after paper, study after study, internal memo after internal memo, a growing archive of evidence that the industry knew about, tracked, and systematically prevented from reaching the people whose lives it described. The cabinet was locked, but cabinets don't stay locked forever. And somewhere in the design departments of American tobacco companies, a different kind of solution was already being manufactured. Not a scientific rebuttal, not a public relations campaign, but a product redesign so brilliant in its cynicism that it would add decades to the industry's growth and hundreds of millions of customers to its global reach. It was white and slim, and it had a small circle of compressed fibre at one end. It looked safe. That was the only thing that mattered. The filtered cigarette was the industry's most profitable lie. It appeared on the American market in force in the early 1950s, timed with a precision that could not have been accidental, arriving just as the first major cancer studies began reaching mainstream newspaper coverage. Lorillard launched Kent Cigarettes in 1952, advertising a proprietary micronite filter that the company claimed removed harmful substances from the smoke before it reached the lungs. The filter contained crocidolite asbestos. Customers who switched to Kent for health reasons spent years inhaling asbestos fibres along with their tobacco smoke. Lorillard knew the filter material within months of launch. Kent remained on sale for 4 years before the asbestos filter was quietly replaced. But the filtered cigarette's deeper deception was simpler than its ingredients. The filter did not meaningfully reduce the harmful compounds in cigarette smoke. Independent laboratory tests conducted in the mid-1950s showed that most filters removed a negligible percentage of the tar and carcinogens that passed through them. Some filters, by altering the draw resistance of the cigarette, actually cause smokers to inhale more deeply and more frequently, increasing rather than decreasing overall exposure. The tobacco companies had conducted their own internal tests and reached the same conclusions. The filter was not a health device. It was a visual reassurance, a small white cylinder of compressed fibre whose primary function was to exist at the end of the cigarette where a smoker's lips touched it, signalling safety through appearance rather than chemistry. Sales of filtered cigarettes went from less than 1% of the market in 1950 to more than 50% by 1960. Dot Holloway switched to filtered Winstons in 1955. She made the switch for the same reason millions of others did. The filter felt like a concession to caution, a small acknowledgement of the cancer conversation without requiring the impossible step of stopping entirely. The cigarette still tasted like a cigarette. The filter made the choice feel reasonable. She was 30 years old, her children were 6 and 4, and the gap between the version of herself that smoked and the version that didn't had become so wide she could no longer clearly picture the second one. While the filter reassured the existing market, the industry was simultaneously building the next one. In January 1964, US Surgeon General Luther Terry released the report that his advisory committee had spent 14 months preparing, a 387-page document reviewing more than 7,000 scientific studies on tobacco and health. The conclusion, stated in language that cut through every qualification and caveat the tobacco industry had spent a decade cultivating, was direct. Cigarette smoking causes lung cancer in men. It causes laryngeal cancer. It is the most important cause of chronic bronchitis in the United States. Terry held his press conference on a Saturday, deliberately chosen to minimize stock market disruption. Terry himself had smoked a pipe until the day before the announcement. He quit that morning. Cigarette stocks fell, then recovered within a week. Annual cigarette sales in the United States dipped slightly in 1964, then resumed their climb. The Surgeon General's report, the most significant government health statement in American history to that point, produced a detectable but temporary ripple in the consumption curve of a product consumed by 42% of all American adults. The industry watched the sales data with something close to relief. The reason the report produced so little behavioral change is the same reason Dot Holloway read about it in the newspaper and still smoked through the reading. Information about risk, delivered to a person already dependent on a substance that chemically suppresses the brain's capacity for long-term risk assessment, does not travel the same path as information delivered to a person with a free choice. The risk calculation was not broken. It was simply operating in a nervous system that had been rewired, gradually and invisibly, over years of daily nicotine exposure. Evelyn Marsh saw this every week. By the mid-1960s, she was practicing in a dedicated pulmonology unit and treating 4 to 5 new lung cancer cases each week. She had stopped smoking in 1961, not easily, not cleanly, but completely, after a patient whose face she would remember for the rest of her life asked her, during what both of them knew was one of their last appointments, whether she smoked. When she answered yes, the patient looked at the window rather than at her. Marsh went home that night and flushed the remaining cigarettes in her apartment down the toilet. The following 9 days were the worst she could remember, worse than anything in her medical training, and she'd done her residency on 36-hour shifts. She'd begun to tell her smoking patients directly and without the diplomatic softening she'd been trained to use, exactly what their x-rays showed and what she expected to follow. The conversations rarely produced the response she hoped for. Most patients left her office, descended in the elevator, walked out to the street and lit a cigarette before they reached the corner. She had watched this happen from the window of her 4th-floor office enough times that she had stopped watching. The industry, having survived the Surgeon General's report with its market largely intact, now executed the second phase of its expansion strategy, one that Martian researchers like her had not yet fully anticipated, because it did not target existing smokers. It targeted people who had not yet started. Virginia Slims launched in 1968. The brand's tagline, "You've come a long way, baby," was not accidental language. It connected cigarette smoking explicitly to the women's liberation movement, framing the product as an expression of independence rather than a health risk. The cigarettes were longer, slimmer, and packaged in designs that no previous brand had attempted. The advertising ran in magazines read by women in their 20s and teenagers in their late teens. Female smoking rates among Americans aged 18 to 24 climbed sharply through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The industry was not finished with its new markets. It was just getting started. By the early 1970s, American and British tobacco companies had identified where the next growth would come from. Countries with no health warning requirements, no advertising restrictions, no surgeon general, and populations that had not yet been exposed to the decades of public health messaging that had at least slowed consumption growth in Western Europe and North America, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. Philip Morris opened operations in the Philippines and Malaysia. British American Tobacco expanded aggressively in Nigeria and Kenya. Brown and Williamson moved into Bangladesh. In each new market, the playbook was the same one that had worked in America 40 years earlier. Celebrity endorsements, sports sponsorships, free samples, and the association of the product with modernity, prosperity, and aspiration. In countries where a week's wages bought a modest meal, a cigarette was a small, affordable piece of the world that the television showed and the billboard promised. The export strategy worked beyond the industry's own projections. By 1980, the United States was the world's largest exporter of tobacco products, and the countries absorbing those exports had none of the regulatory infrastructure that had taken American public health advocates 30 years to build. Dot Holloway was 55 in 1980. She had tried to quit 6 times. The longest she'd managed was 22 days in 1973, before her mother's death, and the logistics of grief had brought her back. She now smoked half a pack a day rather than a full one, a reduction she had achieved through effort that most people in her life did not know she was making, and would not have understood if she had described it. Her chronic cough had started in 1974. Her doctor called it smoker's cough, which was accurate in that it identified the cause, and useless in that it identified no solution. Her son David, 28, smoked. He had started at 16. Dot had never said anything about it. To say something would have required her to be standing on ground she didn't occupy. Her granddaughter Claire was not yet born. But in filing cabinets in corporate offices in Louisville, Richmond, and Winston-Salem, there were documents that had been written before Claire's parents had met. Documents that described, in precise internal language, exactly what the product was, what it did, and how it did it. Documents that the people who wrote them had ensured would never reach a courtroom or a newspaper, or the desk of a researcher like Evelyn Marsh. One of those documents had been written in 1963 by a researcher at Brown and Williamson. His name was Addison Yeoman, and he had written it as an internal memo summarizing his team's research conclusions. The memo was 8 pages long. Its central finding, stated without qualification in the 3rd paragraph, was that nicotine was addictive, not habit-forming, not dependency-inducing, but addictive, and that the company was therefore in the business of selling an addictive drug. Yeoman's memo was classified. It went into the cabinet. It stayed there for 30 years. The cabinet stayed locked for 30 years. The question is not how a document like that stayed hidden for 3 decades. The answer to that is money, lawyers, and institutional silence. The question is what happened to the man who wrote it, and what happened to the others who reached the same conclusion through different corridors of the same industry. That question has an answer. It is not the answer anyone who worked in those offices in the early 1960s would have predicted out loud. But it is the answer that changed everything, and it came not from a scientist, not from a regulator, not from a journalist. It came from a paralegal with a photocopier and a decision he made alone, in a room at night, that he would later describe as the clearest choice of his life. Merrill Williams was not a scientist. He was not a journalist. He was a failed actor and part-time academic who needed work, and in 1988 he took a contract paralegal position at a law firm in Louisville, Kentucky, that handled document management for Brown and Williamson Tobacco Corporation. His job was straightforward. He was given boxes of internal company documents and told to review them, categorize them by legal relevance, and flag items for attorney attention. The work was tedious and poorly paid. He sat in a room with other contract workers, moving through paper, and the expectation was that he would do exactly what the others did: process the documents and think nothing of them. He began reading them, not skimming for legal categories, but reading, the way a person reads something that is changing their understanding of the world in real time. The documents Williams processed over the following years included internal research memos, executive correspondence, scientific reports, and strategic planning materials spanning from the early 1960s through the 1980s. What they contained, assembled across thousands of pages, was a precise and detailed record of what Brown and Williamson had known, when they had known it, and what they had done with that knowledge. The company had known nicotine was addictive since at least 1963. That was Addison Yeoman's memo, the one that used the word addictive without qualification and described the company as being in the business of selling a drug. But Yeoman's memo was not an outlier. It was part of a sustained internal research effort that had continued for years and produced consistent findings. Nicotine was addictive, cigarettes caused cancer, and the company's own scientists had confirmed, both with methods rigorous enough that the conclusions were not seriously disputed within the research division. What happened to that research division is the part that reframes everything before it. In the mid-1960s, Brown and Williamson brought in an outside law firm to review its internal research program. The recommendation that came back was not a scientific one, it was a legal one. Research that produced findings harmful to the company's litigation position should be conducted, if at all, under attorney-client privilege, a legal structure that would make the findings immune to discovery in civil lawsuits. The research program was restructured accordingly. Scientists who asked the wrong questions found their projects defunded. At least 2 researchers who pushed their findings toward external publication were removed from their positions. The work continued, but its results now flowed into legal files rather than scientific journals. Williams understood what this meant. He had a heart condition, and working in a building whose hallways smelled of cigarette smoke while reading documents that described in clinical detail what cigarette smoke did to cardiac tissue gave the knowledge a specific weight. He began making photocopies, not dozens, thousands. 4,000 pages of internal documents, removed from the building piece by piece over months, carried out in the lining of his coat on some occasions, and in stacks tucked into files on others. He was not trained in security evasion. He was careful and methodical and angry. In 1994, those documents reached the press. The timing was not accidental. In April 1994, the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Health had scheduled hearings on tobacco regulation, chaired by Representative Henry Waxman of California. The Waxman hearings became one of the most watched moments in the history of American public health policy, not for what the congressman said, but for what the tobacco executive said. On April 14, 1994, 7 chief executives of the major American tobacco companies appeared before the subcommittee and were placed under oath. One by one, in response to direct questioning, each of the 7 stated that they did not believe nicotine was addictive. The testimonies were filmed. They were broadcast live. watching 7 men in identical dark suits deliver nearly identical answers to the same question, under oath, while millions of Americans were at that moment physically unable to stop buying their products, produced a specific kind of public outrage that press releases and scientific papers had never managed to generate. Evelyn Marsh, 71 years old and recently retired, watched the hearings on a television in her Philadelphia apartment. She had a persistent cough that had started the previous winter and had not resolved. She did not miss the significance of that detail about herself. She had quit smoking in 1961, 33 years earlier, but the cumulative exposure of 20 years of a pack a day had left deposits in her lungs that no amount of subsequent clean air had fully cleared. She watched the 7th executive complete his testimony and turned off the television. Then the Williams documents hit the newspapers, and the executive's sworn testimony began to dissolve in real time. The documents, fragments at first, then larger sections, then analysed summaries, revealed the architecture of what had been done. The Yeoman Memo, the restructured research program, the attorney-client privilege strategy, memos in which company executives discussed the marketing of cigarettes to teenagers as the critical replacement population for smokers who died. One document, written in 1975 by a Brown & Williamson marketing executive, described the youth market in language so precise and unsentimental that when it was read aloud during a subsequent congressional session, the room went quiet. But the Williams documents revealed something that went beyond Brown & Williamson. They revealed that what Brown & Williamson had done was not an isolated corporate failure. The strategy of burying internal science, manufacturing public doubt, and restructuring research programs under legal privilege had been coordinated across the industry through the same TIRC framework that had presented itself to the public since 1954 as a good faith research organisation. The tobacco industry had not merely lied, it had built a system for lying, a system precise enough that individual employees could operate within it without understanding the full shape of what they were part of, which is exactly how the system was designed. This was the revelation that reframed everything. Every doctor who'd been reassured by Turk press releases in the 1950s and 1960s, every journalist who had dutifully reported both sides of the cigarette cancer debate, every patient like Dot Holloway, who had read about the scientific controversy and understood it as a genuine controversy rather than a manufactured one. Every person who had made the choice to keep smoking because the evidence seemed unclear. They had made that choice inside an information environment that had been deliberately engineered to produce exactly that decision. The doubt was not a byproduct. It was the product. And then came the detail that the Williams documents had set up. The detail that made researchers who thought they understood the industry's behaviour revise their understanding completely. It concerned not just what was in the cigarettes, but what the companies had done to them. In the late 1960s, researchers at several tobacco companies, working independently, had discovered that the bioavailability of nicotine, the speed and efficiency with which it crossed from the lungs into the bloodstream and then to the brain, could be significantly increased through a specific chemical process. The process involved adding ammonia compounds to the tobacco during manufacturing. Ammonia raised the pH of the smoke, converting nicotine from its salt form, which absorbs slowly, into its freebase form, which absorbs almost instantaneously. The difference between nicotine salt and freebase nicotine in terms of the brain's response is not incremental. Freebase nicotine reaches the brain's reward circuits faster, produces a sharper dopamine spike, and creates a stronger reinforcement signal than the same dose in salt form. Philip Morris had developed and deployed this process in Marlboro cigarettes in the late 1960s. The result was a product that delivered nicotine to the brain more efficiently than any previous cigarette. And Marlboro went from a minor brand with less than 2% of the US market in 1954 to the best-selling cigarette in the world by 1972. The companies had not stumbled into this. They had engineered it. Dot Holloway, 69 years old in 1994, watched fragments of the Waxman hearings on the evening news. She had quit smoking 9 years earlier, after her first heart attack, at a point when her cardiologist had told her, with the specific directness that cardiologists use when they have decided to stop being gentle, that another cardiac event would likely kill her. The quitting had taken 11 months of attempts, failures, and a physical experience she described to her daughter as feeling like she was taking her own skin off. She had managed it only with the help of a nicotine patch program that had become available in the early 1990s. Watching the 7 executives on the screen, she felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. She'd spent 20 years believing that her inability to stop smoking reflected something specific about her own character, a weakness in will, a failure of discipline, a personal inadequacy that her successful friends didn't share. She had never spoken about this to anyone. It sat in her like a private verdict she'd handed down against herself. The executives on the television screen were saying nicotine was not addictive. Her granddaughter Claire was 14. Claire had come home from school that week with something tucked into the pocket of her backpack. It was small, rectangular, and looked exactly like the USB drives her computer class used. It produced no smoke. It had no smell that travelled. Her parents had not noticed it. Dot noticed it. She saw Claire's hand move toward the pocket and then stop. The specific arrested gesture of someone managing a craving in a social context where they cannot act on it. Dot recognised that gesture. She'd been making it for 20 years before anyone gave her a name for what it meant. She did not yet know what the device in her granddaughter's pocket was. She did not know what was inside it. She did not know that the molecule it contained had been through 40 years of engineering refinements since the first freebase experiments in a Philip Morris laboratory, and that what Claire was carrying delivered nicotine to the brain faster, more cleanly, and more completely than any cigarette Dot had ever smoked. The industry had lost the cigarette war. The documents were out. The lawsuits were coming. The settlement figures being discussed in legal circles were numbers that had never appeared in civil litigation before. But the product had already changed its shape, and the people building the new version had learned everything the old version's makers had left behind. In November 1998, the Attorneys General of 46 American states signed an agreement with the 4 largest tobacco companies that settled litigation spanning decades, involving evidence drawn directly from the documents Merrill Williams had carried out of that Louisville building a decade earlier. The master settlement agreement required the tobacco industry to pay $246 billion to the states over 25 years. It banned billboard advertising. It prohibited the use of cartoon characters in tobacco marketing, a provision aimed directly at Joe Camel, the R.J. Reynolds mascot that research had shown was recognised by 6-year-olds at the same rate as Mickey Mouse. It restricted tobacco sponsorship of sports events and concerts. It dissolved the TIRC and its successor organisations. It required the companies to release millions of pages of internal documents to a publicly accessible archive. $246 billion, the largest civil litigation settlement in the history of the United States. For a specific moment, perhaps a week, perhaps a month, it felt like an ending. Smoking rates in America, which had been declining slowly since the mid-1970s, began declining faster. Public smoking bans spread from California outward across the country through the late 1990s and 2000s. Cigarette taxes rose sharply. By 2005, American smoking prevalence had dropped to 21%, down from 42% in 1964. The science had taken 50 years to become policy. The policy was working. Evelyn Marsh wrote a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine in 1999, the year after the settlement. She was 76. The letter was brief, 3 paragraphs. She described her career, her patient population, and the number she had been keeping privately in a notebook for 40 years. The total count of lung cancer patients she had personally treated from her residency in 1948 through her retirement in 1993. The number was 1,400. Of those, 1,371 had been smokers. The journal published the letter. Marsh received 43 responses from physicians across the country, many of them describing nearly identical notebooks, nearly identical numbers, nearly identical decades of watching the same pattern repeat. She was not around to see what came next. She died in 2004 at 81 of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. She had not smoked since 1961. The disease had developed from cumulative damage accrued in the 2 decades before that. Tissue changes so slow and structural that they persisted long after the cause was removed. The cause, meanwhile, had found a new container. In 2003, in Beijing, a Chinese pharmacist named Hon Lik was working at a medical device company and carrying a grief he had not found a way to put down. His father had died of lung cancer the previous year. His father had been a heavy smoker. Hon Lik was himself a heavy smoker and had been trying to quit for years with limited success. He was working late one night and fell asleep wearing a nicotine patch, something that is warned against on the packaging, because the continuous nicotine delivery during sleep produces vivid and disturbing dreams. He woke from a dream about drowning, then breathing, then a mist that was not water. The next morning he began designing a device. His concept was straightforward in principle. Heat a nicotine solution to the point of vaporization without burning it, producing an inhalable aerosol rather than combustion smoke. No burning tobacco meant no tar, no carbon monoxide, and no combustion byproducts, the compounds responsible for most of tobacco's carcinogenic activity. The nicotine could be delivered to the lungs and then to the bloodstream and brain through the same physiological pathway as cigarette smoke, but without the fire. Hon Lik filed his patent in 2003. He named the device Ruyan, like smoke. His intention was cessation. He had watched his father die of the combustion products of tobacco and wanted to create a path off cigarettes that didn't require the brutal pharmacological negotiation he had experienced himself. The device he invented was, in his conception, a medical tool. What happened to his invention is one of the most consequential unintended consequences in the history of public health, and to understand it fully, it is necessary to understand what 2 Stanford MBA graduates were doing in a San Francisco apartment in 2007. Adam Bowen and James Monsies had written their Stanford graduate thesis on redesigning the cigarette, not banning it, not replacing it with a medical device, redesigning it, applying the principles of consumer product design to a delivery mechanism that had barely changed aesthetically since the 1880s. They founded a company called Pax Labs, and within it developed a product they eventually spun off into a separate entity. They called it Juul. The Juul device, launched commercially in 2015, was different from every e-cigarette that had preceded it in ways that mattered more than its appearance, though its appearance mattered considerably. It was the size and shape of a USB flash drive. It had no button. It produced almost no visible vapor cloud. It made no sound. It could be used in a school bathroom, a classroom, an airplane seat, or a family dinner without producing any of the signals that previous nicotine delivery methods had generated. No smoke, no smell that travelled more than a foot, no physical evidence remaining after use. The nicotine cartridges, pods, use nicotine salt chemistry rather than freebase nicotine. This distinction requires attention. Earlier e-cigarettes had used freebase nicotine. the same form that Philip Morris had engineered into Marlboro in the 1960s. But freebase nicotine in high concentrations produces a harsh sensation in the throat that limits the amount a person can comfortably inhale. Nicotine salt, the same form found naturally in tobacco leaves, allowed dramatically higher nicotine concentrations to be delivered smoothly, without harshness, without the physical signal that would otherwise tell the body it was taking in more than it wanted. A single Juul pod contained as much nicotine as a full pack of 20 cigarettes. It was consumed in roughly the same time frame that a moderate smoker consumed a pack, but without the social friction, the smell, the ash, or the physical duration of smoking 20 individual cigarettes. The product was engineered, whether intentionally or not, to make overconsumption invisible. Juul's marketing in its early phase targeted young adults through imagery and aesthetics, drawn directly from the visual language of technology and lifestyle culture rather than tobacco culture. Launch parties in urban venues, social media campaigns featuring young people in well-lit spaces, flavours, mango, creme brulee, cool mint, fruit medley, that had no precedent in cigarette product lines and that bore no relationship to the taste of tobacco. By 2018, Juul held 75% of the American e-cigarette market. The same year, the US Food and Drug Administration declared youth e-cigarette use a national epidemic. The numbers behind that declaration were not gradual. Between 2017 and 2018, e-cigarette use among American high school students increased by 78% in a single year. Among middle school students, the increase was 48%. More than 3.6 million American minors were using e-cigarettes, the majority of them Juul. Claire Holloway was 18 in 2018. She'd been using a Juul since she was 14, since the afternoon it appeared at a lunch table at her school in Winston-Salem, passed around like a USB drive someone wanted to share, which is exactly what it looked like. She had not thought of it as tobacco. There was nothing about it that connected in her mind to the cigarettes her grandmother had smoked. The two objects occupied entirely different categories in her perception. One was a relic of a previous era, the other was simply a part of her day, small and clean and unremarkable. By 16, she was using 2 pods a week. By 17, 3. She had tried to stop twice. Once for a school health project, once because a boy she was interested in had said something about it she hadn't anticipated. The first attempt lasted 6 days, the second lasted 4. The withdrawal was not dramatic in the way she'd imagined drug withdrawal would be. It was subtler and more pervasive than that. A flatness, a specific inability to concentrate that made her feel cognitively slower than herself. A restlessness at night that made sleep shallow and unrewarding. On day 4 of the second attempt, she picked up the device in the morning not because she was desperate but because she was tired and the day ahead looked long. She was 17 years old, and the most difficult thing in her daily life was a device that looked like stationery. Dot Holloway died in October 2009 at 84. Heart disease, the specific cardiac deterioration that follows decades of vascular damage from smoking, persisting and progressing even after cessation, the delayed bill that nicotine's real costs present years after the habit ends. Her last years had been spent in a house on the east side of Winston-Salem, 3 blocks from the Reynolds plant where she had first lit a cigarette in 1944. The plant had been converted to mixed-use commercial space. The smell of curing tobacco was gone from the air. She knew Claire vaped. She had not found the language for a conversation that would have required her to explain things she'd never spoken about. The 22 failed days of her longest quit attempt. The 2 a.m. kitchen moment in 1948. The particular private verdict she had carried for decades about her own character. She'd tried once, not long before she died, sitting with Claire at the kitchen table. She had put her hand briefly over her granddaughter's and then withdrawn it without saying anything. Claire had looked at her. Dot had looked at the table. Some things are communicated that way, in the space between an extended hand and a withdrawn one. Whether Claire understood what the gesture held was a question that would only be answered later, after the cost had been counted. And the counting was not finished, not even close. Because in offices in Bern, in Kuala Lumpur, in Jakarta and Manila and Lagos, different teams were working on the next version, smaller, cleaner, more efficient. And the lesson they had taken from the Juul story was not a warning. It was a blueprint. The settlement had drawn a line. The industry simply stepped over it and kept walking. Philip Morris International, the overseas arm of Philip Morris that had been legally separated from its American parent specifically to operate outside US regulatory reach, had never been party to the master settlement agreement. It was a different corporate entity, headquartered in Lausanne, Switzerland, selling to markets where the 1998 agreement had no jurisdiction and where the decades of American litigation precedent offered no protective framework for consumers. In 2022, Philip Morris International sold 695 billion cigarettes, not in America, everywhere else. The numbers from the developing world had been accumulating quietly throughout the same years that American and Western European smoking rates were declining and being celebrated as a public health success. Indonesia, a country where cigarettes are classified as a staple food product for tax purposes, had a male smoking prevalence of 76% in 2019. Not 76% of adults, 76% of all Indonesian men. Children in rural Indonesian villages started smoking at ages that American pediatricians encounter only in historical literature. A 2019 photograph that circulated briefly in Western media showed a 9-year-old boy in Sumatra smoking his morning cigarette before school, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. He started at 5. Indonesia was not an anomaly. It was a destination. The tobacco industry's internal projections from the 1980s had identified the developing world as the replacement market for the regulatory losses being sustained in North America and Western Europe. Those projections had proven accurate with an exactness that retrospective analysis finds difficult to look at directly. Every percentage point of smoking decline in the United States between 1980 and 2010 corresponded to aggressive market expansion in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. The global cigarette consumption figure barely moved during 3 decades of celebrated Western public health progress. The crisis had not shrunk, it had migrated. Meanwhile, the vaping industry's collision with regulatory reality in the United States produced consequences that nobody in the public health community had modelled. In the summer of 2019, emergency rooms across the American Midwest began seeing patients with an acute respiratory illness that did not match any known pathogen. The patients were young, median age 24. Their chest X-rays showed bilateral lung damage consistent with severe chemical pneumonitis. They were deteriorating fast, some requiring ventilators within days of admission. The cases multiplied through August and September, spreading geographically along patterns that suggested a product rather than a person-to-person infection. The CDC named the condition EVALI, e-cigarette or vaping product use-associated lung injury. By February 2020, EVALI had killed 68 people in the United States and hospitalized more than 2,800. The median age of the dead was 34. The primary culprit, identified after months of investigation, was vitamin E acetate, an oily compound used as a cutting agent in illicit THC vaping cartridges rather than in commercial nicotine products. But the investigation's framing concealed an important secondary finding. The lungs of long-term nicotine vapors, examined in the course of the EVALI investigation, showed inflammatory changes not seen in non-vapors. Changes that had no established clinical name because the population of long-term vapers was not yet old enough to have developed end-stage disease. Researchers were not looking at outcomes. They were looking at early markers whose eventual destination was unknown. The study of long-term vaping effects in 2019 was comparable in its state of completeness to the study of long-term cigarette effects in 1940. The population had not been using the product long enough to develop the diseases that long-term exposure eventually produces. The absence of those diseases in the data was not evidence of safety. It was evidence of time, specifically the absence of enough of it. This point was made clearly in the scientific literature. It did not travel clearly into public discourse. Juul's response to the EVALI crisis and the simultaneous congressional pressure was a sequence of decisions that public health researchers found painfully familiar. The company disputed the causal evidence. It emphasized the vitamin E acetate finding in illicit THC products. It announced voluntary withdrawal of certain flavored pods from the market while continuing to sell others. It commissioned studies on harm reduction relative to cigarettes, a comparison that framed the question as better than cigarettes, rather than safe, and that critics noted was precisely the rhetorical structure the tobacco industry had used to defend filtered cigarettes in the 1950s. Then came the ownership disclosure that reframed the entire narrative. In December 2018, the same month the FDA declared the youth vaping epidemic, Altria Group announced that it had acquired a 35% stake in Juul Labs for $12.8 billion. Altria Group is the parent company of Philip Morris USA. The company that had spent 50 years selling cigarettes, that had sat at the Plaza Hotel in 1953 to design the manufactured doubt strategy, that had sent its executives before Congress in 1994 to testify under oath that nicotine was not addictive. That company now owned more than a third of the device that had addicted a new generation of American teenagers to nicotine. The investment was not secret. It was announced in a press release. The company that had lost the cigarette war had bought its way into the replacement product, while the replacement product was in the process of being regulated, litigated, and publicly condemned. The 35% stake meant Altria had a financial interest in Juul's survival and growth at precisely the moment regulatory pressure threatened both. The precise legal and strategic advantages this created for Juul in subsequent negotiations with the FDA were not spelled out in the press release. Claire Holloway turned 19 in 2019, the year of EVALI. She read about the outbreak on her phone in fragments between classes. The coverage frightened her. She knew vapers who had stopped abruptly after reading the same fragments. She herself cut back for 2 weeks, then returned to her previous level of use when the coverage faded and the immediate social pressure relaxed. She was not indifferent to the risk. She simply could not sustain the discomfort of the alternative at a moment when everything else in her life was also demanding something from her. She was a college freshman. Her father still smoked cigarettes. Her grandmother was 10 years dead. She did not know about the Altria investment. She did not know that the company whose name appeared on no part of her device had been in the business of selling nicotine addiction for longer than her grandmother had been alive. She knew only that quitting was harder than she had expected, and that the hardness of it felt as it had felt to Dot in 1948 and to Evelyn Marsh in 1961, like something internal, a personal deficit rather than a pharmacological fact. That perception, the privatization of addiction as individual failure, was not an accident of psychology. It was the industry's most durable achievement, more lasting than any product, more effective than any marketing campaign. It required no maintenance. It ran on its own. Juul paid $438 million in a multi-state settlement in 2022, resolving claims that it had marketed to minors. The settlement required no admission of wrongdoing. The same year, the FDA issued a marketing denial order against Juul, a ruling that would have removed the product from American shelves, before a federal court temporarily blocked enforcement pending appeal. The legal machinery moved slowly. The product stayed on shelves. Philip Morris International, watching from Lausanne, had been developing its own alternative to cigarettes since 2008, a product called IQOS, heated tobacco, not vaping. The device heated a specially processed tobacco stick to 350 degrees Celsius, hot enough to release nicotine-containing aerosol, but below the 600-degree combustion point that produced the carcinogenic byproducts of burning tobacco. Philip Morris invested $9 billion in IQOS development and manufacturing infrastructure over a decade, the largest single investment in product development in the company's history. PMI applied to the FDA for a modified risk tobacco product designation for IQOS, a regulatory category that would allow the company to market the product as less harmful than cigarettes. The FDA approved the designation in 2020, with specific restrictions on the claims PMI could make. IQOS was now legally a reduced-risk product in the United States, marketed by the company that had spent half a century denying that cigarettes posed any risk at all. IQOS launched in Japan in 2014 and captured 25% of the Japanese tobacco market within 5 years. It then moved into South Korea, Italy, Russia, and across Southeast Asia, targeting the same markets that traditional cigarettes had built over the previous 40 years. PMI's public positioning described IQOS as the company's transition away from combustible tobacco, a smoke-free future built on reduced-risk alternatives. PMI's financial reports described a company that simultaneously sold 695 billion cigarettes per year, while building the infrastructure for the product it claimed would replace them. Both descriptions were accurate. In 2023, a new product category accelerated past regulatory attention in virtually every market simultaneously. Nicotine pouches, small white rectangles of cellulose fiber containing nicotine, placed between the lip and gum, required no device, produced no vapor, involved no tobacco leaf, and left no trace visible to anyone standing nearby. The nicotine they contained was either extracted from tobacco or, in newer formulations, synthesized entirely in a laboratory, technically not tobacco-derived at all, which placed some products in a regulatory grey zone that existing tobacco legislation had not anticipated and did not cover. Zyn, On, Velo. The brand names were short, clean, and designed to communicate nothing about what they contained. By 2024, nicotine pouch sales in the United States had grown 580% over 3 years. The primary growth demographic was adults aged 18 to 34, the same population that had driven the early Juul numbers. In Scandinavia, where a smokeless tobacco product called snus had been used for generations, public health researchers noted that nicotine pouch users included a significant and growing proportion of people who had never previously used any tobacco or nicotine product. Not switching. Starting. Claire Holloway had quit vaping in 2022 at 22 after a respiratory episode during a run that landed her in an urgent care clinic with chest tightness severe enough that the attending physician ordered a chest X-ray. The X-ray was clear. The physician told her the episode was likely bronchospasm, possibly vaping related, and recommended she stop. She stopped. The quitting took 4 months of diminishing attempts during which she used nicotine replacement patches, then nicotine gum, then nothing, white-knuckling through the final weeks with the specific grim determination of someone who had decided to treat it as a problem of will rather than biochemistry. She was wrong about the biochemistry, but the determination worked anyway this time. She was 23 when she finally succeeded. She'd been addicted to nicotine for 9 years. She'd never smoked a cigarette. She enrolled in a public health graduate program the following year. Her thesis research concerned the regulatory gaps in nicotine pouch legislation across US states. During her research, she found herself reading internal documents from the nicotine pouch manufacturers, marketing research reports, flavor development memos, consumer demographic analyses that had been released through an FTC inquiry. She had read documents like these before in the course of her coursework, the Brown and Williamson files, the TIRC correspondence, the 1953 Plaza Hotel meeting records. She had studied them as history, as evidence of what a previous era's institutions had permitted. Reading the new documents, she found herself checking the dates on the pages, not because they were hard to believe, because they were dated 2021 and 2022 and 2023. The language was different, the product names were different, the delivery mechanism was entirely new, the structure was the same. Claire Holloway submitted her thesis in March 2026. It ran to 187 pages. The title was precise and academic and said everything in 11 words. Regulatory arbitrage in novel nicotine products, how industry outpaces public health response. Her faculty advisor called it the most thoroughly sourced graduate thesis he'd reviewed in 20 years. He said this in the same sentence in which he told her that 3 of the regulatory agencies she had written to for comment had not responded. She printed 2 copies, one for the university archive, one she kept. What had changed since 1998 was real and measurable and should not be minimized. American adult smoking prevalence had fallen from 42% in 1964 to approximately 11% in 2025, the lowest recorded level since the cigarette became a mass-market product. Warning labels existed on every pack sold in the United States, Canada, Australia, and across the European Union, including graphic photographic images of diseased tissue that Philip Morris's lawyers had fought in court for years before losing. Public smoking had been banned in workplaces, restaurants, bars, and public transit across most of the developed world. Tobacco advertising had been stripped from television, radio, billboards, and most print media. The science of nicotine addiction was established, peer-reviewed, and no longer seriously disputed by any credentialed researcher anywhere. 50 years of work had produced those outcomes. 50 years. And in the same period, the global number of smokers had gone from roughly 700 million to 1.3 billion, because the population of the world had grown fastest in exactly the regions where the regulatory infrastructure that produced those American and European gains had never been built. The math of that outcome is worth stating plainly. Every percentage point of smoking decline achieved in wealthy nations over 50 years was more than offset by growth in countries where tobacco companies had operated without meaningful restriction, using the same strategies: aspirational marketing, sports sponsorship, youth targeting, product placement. That regulation had eventually eliminated in the West. The global death toll from tobacco had not fallen during the era of Western public health success. It had risen from approximately 2.5 million deaths per year in 1980 to 8 million per year in 2026. The progress was real. The crisis grew anyway. What did not change? The list is specific and important. Tobacco remains a legal product in every country on Earth. No nation has banned cigarette sales outright, though Bhutan came closest with severe restrictions, and New Zealand passed a generational ban in 2022 before repealing it in 2023 under lobbying pressure and fiscal arguments about tax revenue. The global tobacco industry generates approximately $900 billion in annual revenue. In 2026, the combined total spending by all governments worldwide on tobacco control, public health campaigns, cessation programs, enforcement, is estimated at less than $1 billion. The ratio is 900 to 1. Philip Morris International continues to sell cigarettes in 180 countries, while simultaneously marketing IQOS as the responsible future of nicotine. British American Tobacco sells both cigarettes and Velo nicotine pouches through the same distribution networks. Japan Tobacco International markets traditional cigarettes in Africa, while positioning its heated tobacco product Plume as a harm reduction innovation for Asian markets. The companies have not left the cigarette business. They have added new businesses alongside it and used the new businesses' harm reduction framing to rehabilitate the corporate reputation that the cigarette business destroyed. The structure of this is not complicated. It is simply difficult to look at without flinching. Claire's thesis documented the regulatory gap with the precision her grandmother had never had access to when trying to understand why quitting was so hard. The FDA's authority over tobacco products, granted by the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act of 2009, applied specifically to tobacco-derived nicotine. Synthetic nicotine, nicotine manufactured in a laboratory from non-tobacco precursors, fell outside that authority until 2022, a gap that nicotine pouch manufacturers had exploited with deliberate speed, launching synthetically nicotined products in the window between the gap's identification and its closure. By the time the regulatory amendment passed, the products were established in the market, the brands were recognizable, and removal would have required affirmative action rather than a simple failure to approve. The pattern had a name in Claire's thesis. She called it regulatory lead time exploitation, the practice of launching a product in the period between a regulatory gap's identification and its eventual closure, establishing market presence before legal authority catches up. It was not a new concept in regulatory theory. It was new in the context of nicotine because the products were new. But the underlying strategy was the same one that had placed filtered cigarettes on the market as a health product in 1952, 2 years before the first major regulatory response to the 1950 cancer studies. The industry had a 70-year head start on the regulators. It had never stopped running. In Indonesia in 2026, the average age of smoking initiation, the age at which a person smokes their first cigarette, is 12, not 16, not 14, 12. The Indonesian tobacco industry, which is domestically owned and employs approximately 6 million people directly and indirectly, has successfully resisted every significant regulatory measure for 4 decades on grounds of economic necessity. The argument is not scientifically credible, it is politically invincible. In Bangladesh, tobacco companies sponsor the school notebooks used by primary school children. The covers printed with brand-adjacent imagery that stops just short of direct advertising, navigating a ban on tobacco advertising with the same creative legalism that American companies used to navigate the 1970 broadcast advertising ban by pivoting their budgets to print and billboards. The developing world is not in an earlier chapter of the tobacco story. It is in the same chapter the United States was in during the 1950s. Abundant product, minimal regulation, no established litigation framework, and a generation of young people being introduced to the molecule before the research catching up to it has reached mainstream culture. The difference is that the people building those markets now have access to 70 years of data about how this story ends. They have read the Dolehill study, they have read the Williams documents, they have read the Master Settlement Agreement. They know. Claire knew all of this when she sat down to write her conclusion. She had spent 2 years reading documents written by people who also knew, who had always known, and had made specific, documented decisions about what to do with that knowledge. The thesis did not end with a policy recommendation. Her advisor had suggested she add one. She'd considered it and declined. She wrote instead a final paragraph that simply described what she'd found in the 2021, 2022, and 2023 internal marketing documents released through the FTC inquiry. The demographic targeting data for nicotine pouches, the flavor development pipeline designed around palatability for users who had never previously used tobacco, the internal projections for growth among 18 to 24-year-olds who would become long-term users. She described the documents accurately and stopped. Her cousin's daughter, her first cousin's child, 8 years old in 2026, living in the same Winston-Salem neighborhood where Dot Holloway had first lit a cigarette in 1944, would be a teenager in 2033. The nicotine pouch market, at its current growth rate, would by then be a $50 billion global industry. The products available in 2033 would be smaller, more discreet, more efficiently engineered, and more aggressively marketed than anything available today. The regulatory frameworks designed to contain them would still be catching up. Whether they would catch up before the next generation was already inside the product, before the gesture of a hand moving toward a pocket and stopping became as ordinary in that girl's life as it had been in her great-great-grandmother's, was a question that Claire's thesis could document but not answer. Some questions accumulate evidence. They do not close.